My name is Joanne Ciulla, and I'm the director of the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers Business School. Before joining Rutgers, I worked at a place called the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. This was the first school of leadership studies in the world, and I was one of the founding faculty who helped design that school. But I began my career in a philosophy department at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, taught philosophy for many years, and then went to Harvard Business School as a Harvard Fellow in Business and Ethics, and that's how I got into business ethics. After that, I went on to Wharton, taught at Wharton, and was one of the faculty that introduced the first required business ethics course at the Wharton School. I've worked for many years in both the fields of business ethics and leadership studies. I got into leadership studies when we were founding the Jepson School, and that was a really exciting endeavor for me, probably the most exciting thing I've ever done, to create an institution from scratch. The university had been given $20 million for this school. It had 5 endowed chairs connected to it. And what we did was create a whole curriculum around leadership, but it was a liberal arts curriculum. As I like to say, it was liberal arts with a point, or liberal arts with a focus. I've always been a great supporter of the humanities, and so even when I've worked with business schools, which is where I am now, I think that humanities, along with business ethics, are probably the most important things we can be teaching our students. So in my career over time, what I've managed to do is to meld together my work on leadership studies with my work in business ethics. There's a lot of similarities between these two fields. They're both relatively new areas of study. They're both fundamental to the way things work in society. But the most astounding thing for me when I got into leadership studies was discovering that there was hardly any work at all on ethics. And what was most interesting about what work there was in ethics was it was best found in the ancient philosophers, who Plato and Aristotle talked a whole lot about the ethics of leaders. But when you looked at the contemporary leadership literature, and here I'm going back to 1990 or so, everything was, there were Kohlberg studies on moral development, but there really wasn't any philosophical work on leadership and ethics. So what I've been doing for the past 26 years or so is actually putting together, laying out the field. So in the Business Ethics Quarterly back in 1995, I published an article called Leadership Ethics Mapping the Territory. And that's where I basically laid out the field and how it intersected, obviously, with the work that we did in business ethics. And so I look constantly at what are the things that are distinctive about being a leader. So in business ethics, you say, what are the distinct challenges that people in business face? What are the distinct ethical issues in business? And I've done the same thing in leadership studies. And it's been wonderful being able to actually work in two different fields with two very different kinds of groups of academics over the years.
Great. Wonderful. So how has your work affected, for example, students and others?
So it's interesting to ask, a lot of people, first of all, think ethics can't be taught. That's a very old debate that we've had. But the work that I've done in both areas has had an interesting effect on students. First of all, I'll start with leadership ethics. In our School of Leadership Studies, one of the things that, being academics in an ivory tower, we didn't think about in terms of our students was that our students would actually go on and become leaders. Now, I know that sounds silly, but that's because we were not a training program. So a lot of times in business, and certainly in business schools and management, you think of leadership as training. It's a bunch of skills that you teach students. But we weren't doing that. We were teaching them history and philosophy and literature and religion and sociology. We were teaching them a whole variety of courses that were really about leadership writ large in the humanities, in the liberal arts. But what was really fun is when you study leadership, you get interested in practicing it. So you don't need to literally teach people about leadership to get them to want to do it. So our students ended up, some years they were the presidents and heads of almost every single organization on campus, and that was gratifying. And then some of our students have been in Congress, they've started their own businesses. So I think in that way we've had an effect on them. The other thing is having the absolute privilege of being able to design an institution. It was designed from day one as something where ethics was a central part of the entire curriculum. It affected how we hired faculty, and it affected all the kinds of courses that we designed. So our students left there with a tremendous social consciousness, a tremendous notion of the moral obligations of leadership. As a matter of fact, the motto of that school was to educate people to take on the moral responsibilities of leadership as service to society. So that's where I think teaching ethics and thinking about ethics and leadership was very important. Then I turned to business ethics, and what's always been delightful to me about business ethics, I taught it. I didn't teach it at Harvard, but I did teach at Wharton. And of course, I teach now Rutgers. I teach the MBA and the undergraduates. Is nowadays, business students, they're either undergraduate business students or they go on to get their MBA, but they've had less liberal arts than most generations of students. And what I find an absolute delight, especially now teaching my MBAs and my undergraduates, is they're kind of blown away when you start teaching them a bit about history and about art and all these other subjects while you're teaching ethics. And I use a lot of art in my classes. I use a lot of history. And it's kind of like they're amazed. I mean, because they just haven't had it. The MBA is even worse because Rutgers is an interesting school. We're the most diverse business school in the entire country. So white native-born Americans are often the minority in my classes. They're from all over the world. And so a lot of them, because they come from other educational systems, have had practically no liberal arts. So when they come into my class and I start doing these things, it's this incredible novelty. And it just keeps bringing home, I mean, I've always been a great lover of the humanities, and it brings home the absolute power of the humanities to sort of lift people up, tickle their imaginations, which of course is part of what also tends to be lacking in business schools is imagination. And I think that's what all of us in business ethics work on, is creating much more imaginative people who are thinking about better ways of not only running businesses, but making life better for everyone else. So I think those are the two ways that my work, and I think the work of many others in this field, has affected our students.
And what about practitioners? I know you have worked out, offline, so to speak, outside the university.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about some of your experiences working. I know you worked with, I think, United Nations and some others.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've also worked with a variety of other groups. And what's curious about it, I talk to a lot of my colleagues in the field who have worked with businesses or nonprofits and other organizations, and they often have a different, let's say, act when they go to their gigs, their business gigs. My act is actually pretty much the same. I teach philosophy to everybody. Now, I teach it in a different way, and everybody, I think, we had a discussion about this the other day at the SBE conference. Do you teach philosophy to MBA students? Of course you do, but everybody has to figure out how to do it in an engaging and fun way that you've got to sell it to them. And, when back in the early 90s, I worked with almost every firm on Wall Street. I did training programs for them. Obviously, we used a lot of case studies from the business, but we also, I also tell them about philosophers. I tell them what Kant would say, talk a little bit about Aristotle, and they find it interesting too. And so I think part of what our field needs to have confidence in is the power of the humanities and philosophy. So part of it is a framing issue of how you frame these things to people. I also had the privilege of working, I was a UNESCO chair in leadership studies for the United Nations. There I worked in Jordan for a few years. And of course, there you have an audience of, say, 40 people from 40 different countries. And these are high potential, mid-career people in all different sectors of society. And they're delightful to teach too, first of all, because that's a very well-educated group of people. And secondly, they are actually even more interested in talking about philosophy than your typical American class. And so those were very, very rewarding and exciting experiences. I've also 2 years worked with the World Economic Forum. I did several seminars for them in Davos. One of the seminars was on leadership in the arts with Peter Gabriel. He was one of our guests, and a very famous cartoonist from South Africa, political cartoonist, who was just marvelous. And we had film directors and other people in it. So I've had one of the things that's been fascinating about being in business ethics, as opposed to if I had stayed in a philosophy department, is I think, and I'm not the only one in our field, that we've had amazing adventures in our lives that we would have never had the opportunity to do if we had been in other fields. Tom Donaldson and I worked together with a company that was riddled with sexual harassment by the most senior people in the company, and so Tom eventually turned it over to me, and we just about brought down the senior management in the company. So you get to do some really fun things. I've also been an expert witness in a tech case. That's a fascinating thing to do. But that's what's so exciting about business ethics is universities and business schools, we have fought and fought and fought for years to keep it in the curriculum, to get it in the curriculum, to have them hire qualified people. But you know, a lot of businesses and organizations, they get it. They know why it's needed, and that's one of the reasons it's exciting to work outside of the university, is these people say, you know, how they come to you and say, how can you help us think about these things? And so I think that's probably, and I think if you talk to many of the people in the field, would be one of the most rich and rewarding aspects of being in the area of business ethics.
Do you want to follow up with your practitioner question?
Sure. And I think it fits very nicely.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
So you've done a lot of work in a variety of corporate settings. What kind of an impact do you think you've had, what sort of a lasting impact do you think you've had on individuals, in corporations, on leaders? And have you seen any particular changes in their behavior as a result of being exposed to one of your seminars, educational opportunities, leadership sessions?
Well, I often don't get a chance to have that much follow-up, especially with the banks. So that's a little bit hard. But there's one. So I have worked with some companies over a longer period of time where I've been able to actually observe what kind of impact some of the work I've done has had on them. One of the companies, this is many years ago, is the Kemper Corporation, which is outside of Chicago. And they invited me in because they had been typically an insurance organization and they had started doing banking. And the two cultures were quite different, and the CEO was rightly concerned about them. First of all, I learned a lot from them because I worked with two other CEOs, both of whom were extraordinary people, and I worked with the transition. And we did several things together that seemed to be very effective. First of all, they both got that if you're going to do any kind of ethics intervention, they had to be seen having that intervention as well. So one of the first things we did, I designed a program for them, and then I trained their trainers on how to teach it. But the very first parts of the program, I actually we did a seminar for all of the senior people and the CEO, and there's a lot of very powerful things like seeing them all sitting there with notebooks in a classroom with your CEO, your COO, your CFO, taking an ethics seminar, and then saying, we're bringing the same seminar to the rest of our people. We put it in the magazine, and then for a few years after, this was really fun, I became kind of their Ann Landers. So I did a monthly ethics case, and I used to make them up, but people would write in, and they really always thought they were real. So we would have these wonderful back and forths about the cases. It was quite challenging because I think real cases are often more powerful than made up ones. But what I had wanted to do over that time was to create a kind of dialogue between them. And it seemed, from the feedback I did get, and again, it's very hard to get that kind of feedback from companies, it seemed to be able to get a conversation going. People were talking about these things. And I'd make up some pretty wild cases that were kind of fun, and people would want to talk about them in the office. But that is one of the things you don't often see. The other funny thing that usually happens, and I'm sure my colleagues who have done this will tell you the same thing, is whenever you're giving a seminar for a company, people will want to come and confess to you either about their sins or tell you about their ethical problems and ask you how to solve them as well. And what I've done from this experience with organizations is I usually do an exercise where everybody brings their own case. And in my textbooks, in my leadership textbook and my business ethics textbook, I've taken these cases, disguised them, and I have some wonderful cases that never are dated that I've gotten from real situations. So, it's a two-way street when I go and do these things, and I think that's the other great thing about being in this field, is when you get to do that, you actually end up learning a whole lot more than you normally would learn, just from reading books and going to conferences. Yeah.
As you know, you've been a member of the Society for Business Ethics, well, for as long as I can remember. And how do you see this field, say, what's it going to look like, say 10 or 20 years from now, even 20 years from now? What are we going to be thinking about? And the second part of the question, what haven't we been thinking about yet? What other issues do we need to address that we haven't?
Well, as I look at the field of business ethics today, I mean, the first and foremost issue is bringing more young people into the field. And that's connected to this other issue of making sure that business schools continue to have business ethics courses. And more importantly, and what's really important for the field, is that they hire people who actually know something about ethics to teach them. Because what's going on in most business schools today is they are contracting out to part-timers, some of whom are not particularly well qualified, business ethics courses. That hurts us as a profession because, of course, we carefully try to train these wonderful Ph.D. students, and then if they can't get jobs, it's not very useful. So the first thing that has had to happen in this field is any Ph.D. student has to know how to teach a conventional business course as well as a business ethics course, because there's very few places where they can only teach business ethics. The other problem is the way the scholarship system works. They have to be able to get their articles into top business journals in most places. And so they have to be able to do more than be a philosopher doing business ethics to do that as well. So those are the first sort of structural issues that we need to do. But let's say we do bring them in, what are the issues that we need to be looking at more in the future? Well, some of the issues have to do with gender, ethnicity, etc. We haven't done that much on it. We need, obviously, to have more diversity in business ethics, but that's easier said than done because of the way that academics falls out, but we need to see how we can possibly do that. Being more international would help the society a lot. We do have several Europeans. We have quite a few Europeans who come to our meetings, but increasing that will strengthen us. But then when we get to the bigger issues, certainly all of the artificial intelligence questions, we've started to have some people interested in those areas. I'd also think that we need to look more at these, things like cryptocurrencies and blockchain. These are the big things on the horizon right now. I remember back in the old days when I started, insider trading was the big issue. And insider trading was a big issue because there were actually, in many of the markets and stock markets, there had been structural changes in laws and everything else, and that's why you had insider trading cases. I think as we go along and we look at the ways in which AI plays a role in how stock markets work and trading works and all of these other things, that's going to be a set of issues that we're going to have to confront on the horizon. Again, this makes it tricky because, when business ethics started, most of the people had a background in philosophy. That's changing now. You're getting more people who have sort of backgrounds in management, who are interested in behavioral ethics. That's all for the good. So we want to keep that variety there, but I think we also want to make sure that we don't end up with a dominance of, say, too many empiricists and not enough theorists. And I think that's a tricky part for the field, and I don't know how that's going to unfold in the future. Again, that's related to these basic structural issues that we face. So all of those things it really get to who the people are in the field. It's not just the subject matter, but who we bring in, what kinds of backgrounds they have, and also getting the word out. And I think that the Society for Business Ethics, by being more conscious of public relations and more conscious of their public image, is going to be very important to us in the future. We need to get the word out that this is such an exciting field to be in. We need to get to deans and business schools. And again, you know, I always like to go back to the point that most endowed chairs in business ethics, of course, were given by businesses. And if we didn't have those endowed chairs, I doubt that the field of business ethics would have actually developed as it has today. It simply wouldn't have, because if we'd left it to business schools, you know, maybe the Catholic ones would have business ethics, but I doubt that the others would. So these are all kind of structural things. We need to work with business so that they can put pressure on business schools. We need to work on the rating agencies, because as you know, most business school deans care about the ratings. The ratings agencies need to sort of weigh in, you know, do they have a business ethics course? Is it a good one? Who's teaching their business ethics course? So I think there's a whole lot of political things that we need to do to strengthen our field. And I think if we do that, that these other things on the horizon that are problems in business will get into our literature and will become a part of our discussion.
And then how does that theme, which is terrific, but I agree with you, how does that then link it back to your responsible leadership work? And how important is that? This is obvious, but talk about that as being part of the business school curriculum.
What's interesting about being in both leadership studies and business ethics is business schools have no problem with leadership courses. They probably even have less problems with leadership ethics courses. And the same's true with business. Since I started doing ethics and leadership, I'm basically doing business ethics, only it's called leadership and ethics. And businesses feel better about that than they do business ethics. Business ethics has always got this attachment to law and things like that that they get uncomfortable with. But in business schools, every business school, every liberal arts school will tell you in their slogan or their PR materials that they're creating leaders. I think that's more the luck of the draw. One of the things I learned from developing the leadership school is that there are things that you have to explicitly do to develop leaders. And in business schools,
for example.
Yeah, and so in business schools, they do a lot of the technique things, you know, public speaking, PR, organizational behavior, but specifically, some of the most important thinking skills for leaders have to do with developing perception or perspective. And developing perspective means you need to understand things about history. You need to understand things about human society. And these are not taught in business schools. And so leadership is, first of all, about, I'm sorry to put it in 3 Ps, but it's about perspective, being able to look at the big picture. One of my favorite quotes on leadership is Chester Barnard, who said, "Leadership is the art of sensing the whole." And if you look at an organization, the difference between leaders and managers is leaders have to look at the whole picture. So perspective, people, understanding people. Well, yes, they take organizational behavior, but of course, you know, in most business schools, the management and organizational behaviors are everybody's least favorite courses, which is pathetic because, of course, the whole deal in business is how do you deal with people? And then problem solving. So critical thinking skills. And we don't see a lot of critical thinking skills in a business school. Yes, you take research methods, but the way most business courses are taught, there's not a lot of critical thinking. And then, of course, they all wonder about this magic entrepreneurship course that's going to make them creative. Well, you know, that's tricky too. I'm not sure you get much creativity out of that, and critical thinking is a fundamental part of creativity and imagination. So I think that if they really want to do leadership, it has to be a much broader-based course. having seen the impact, and we've got lots of evaluation from 25 years of being at a leadership school and having the kind of program we have, that it is the things like history, it is biography, it is art, it's a whole lot of these other things that gives them the imagine. We had more entrepreneurs coming out of a leadership school probably than the business school. So I think that there's the interface between these two can be a strong one, and quite frankly, you know, that might be another career path for people who want to do business ethics, and that is to actually bone up on the leadership literature and go on to teach leadership courses. So I think there's some really interesting ways in which the pairing of these two might achieve the goals of both.
Good. Tom?
I think Joanne's actually anticipated most of the questions I had. The one I was interested in was how you counter the kind of more empiricists who kind of say, how can you prove this is working or bad? You mentioned evaluation there. Can you tell me a little bit how you can respond to them?
It's always difficult to figure out how to evaluate a program. Even course evaluations are contested issues. But how do you evaluate a program? We thought about this quite a bit at the Jepson School because we needed to start saying, well, you know, are we creating leaders, basically? We did, in the early days, we did exit interviews and we then did some tracking. So now they've started to do longitudinal tracking of our students to see where they end up. However, we did a pilot program with the Gallup group. We had the Gallup polling group do this for us. And this was with Nebraska. Gallup funded a leadership program at Nebraska. And so we did a project with them and we tried to operationalize what leadership would look like. So we had questions on that survey that were like, what kinds of initiatives have you taken at work? What kinds of projects have you started? So we tried to look at things that people had actually done. And then, of course, we also tried to look, you know, who had started businesses or who had started. And, of course, a lot of it was interesting, in some years out of the Jepson School, most people went into nonprofits. That's because service learning was so emphasized. And, you know, we teach a course, we started out with a service learning course, and then we went on to a course called Justice and Civil Society, which was our service learning course, only beefed up with a heavy academic input. And it was partly one of the faculty, he was one of the other founders. There were 4 of us who founded that school. And he was very much into it. He was very much a social movement guy. So a lot of them went into the nonprofit sector. A lot of them went into education too. They found that an interesting part of it. But getting back to assessment, so we did that kind of assessment and we actually looked a lot better than the programs we compared with in terms of saying, well, you know, are our students initiative takers? Have they moved up? And now they've got more employment data on people and what they've done. Like we've had people working in the governor's office and things like that. But you know, with a school, it takes a while to actually get them old enough to actually see it. But I think there are ways you can assess it. But what was also interesting at the Jepson School was everybody knew who the Jepson students were at the rest of the university, because of course they had other courses in other departments. A lot of our students were double majors. And the reason why they knew who they were is because they're the ones whose hands were always up. Because in our classes, you just didn't sit quiet. Nobody sat quiet. It wasn't done. And so then they go in other classes, and actually they sometimes got derided for it because it was like, oh, it's a Jepson student. They got their hand up. So that kind of initiative. So how do you think of leadership? Well, it's not a positional thing. It's, are they the ones who take initiative? I mean, I used to describe it to people, when our students graduate, we want them to be the one who, at a minimum, if there's a pothole in their street, they get their neighbors together to get something done about it. That's leadership at the civic level. So even when we wrote our philosophy statement, we said, well, what is a leader? Well, first and foremost, it's a good citizen. I mean, what citizens are supposed to be like in democracy. This is why leadership is so fundamental right now and so badly needed. It's not just that we have bad leaders, it's that we have bad citizens. And our bad citizens have led us to have bad leaders. And we made that very clear at the beginning because the rest of the university wasn't real happy about us having a leadership school. But I said, think of it as a citizen school and think of it as these are the active people you want who are willing to say, hey, this is wrong. Let's get together and do something about it. And then on top of it, we actually taught them how to do that. We had courses on leading groups, leading change. We had policy courses. So all of those kinds of things gave them the tools. But the most important thing is creating, I was on the hiring committee of everybody in that school, including 2 of the deans, is we wanted to create an environment where you were supposed to be active. You weren't allowed to sit on the sidelines at all. And so I think, it's an example of how education can make incredible interventions in people's lives and bring the kinds of people we need to make society better.
Can I ask you, who were the people in the field of business ethics who was most sort of influential or interesting to you in your career?
Well, I'll tell you the person who, in business ethics, I love the work of Daryl Kane. As a matter of fact, I told her, this is a horrible thing for academics to say, but sometimes she writes papers and I say, I wish I had written that paper. Well, Daryl's marvelous, and I think I like her work because in some ways it's a little like what I would aspire to do, and that is she does a delightful mixture of history and solid philosophy and practical problems. So I've always really liked her work. I love Pat Werhane's work because she's blunt and clear, and she takes on she's blunt and clear and has always taken on important issues, but in a solid, well-grounded way. I have no affection for people who can't write. I think it's inexcusable in academics. Business ethics is an interdisciplinary field, and I always tell everyone the first rule of writing is to be kind to your reader. And there's a lot of people who are not kind to their readers. So I like Pat's work. Who else do I like? A lot of work. Tom Donaldson's work's been terrific over the years. Richard DeGeorge, he's a very clear writer as well, and he's done some of the seminal early work in it. Ed Hartman's work on virtue ethics. So there's been many of them over the years whose work I've thought is just terrific. I'm a little idiosyncratic. I like to pick on quirky things to write about, like casuistry and other things. But yeah, I think that if you go back to the early issues of the Business Ethics Quarterly, I was talking to a young man yesterday about this, who's a Ph.D. student, who decided to dig into the early works, where you see all the foundational work being written. It's really extraordinary to see what Pat Werhane, what Richard DeGeorge, Tom Donaldson, and a bunch of others were writing that were really the conceptual foundations of the field. And what I find so interesting about that is that's kind of where I was starting in leadership ethics, is how do you begin, not for me to write them all, but to bring in people who can do that groundwork, foundational work in the field. And fortunately, people like Terry Price and Jess Flanagan and several other people who are now doing leadership ethics have taken over that area to really help broaden the field.
Just one quick, what about your work at Rutgers?
Mm-hmm.
I know this is what, your second year, third year?
2.5, yeah.
Yes, all right, good.
Yeah.
So how do you see that linking back to your work at the Jepson School at the University of Richmond?
So I decided at the ripe old age of 60-something, won't tell you the something, that I was going to change places. And so I had been at the Jepson School for 25 years. And I was recruited to become first the research director, then I ended up being the director of the Institute for Ethical Leadership. In some ways, it was actually a logical move for me, because it allowed me to continue working in leadership ethics, but it put me in a research place where I actually could do something I couldn't do at Jepson. Jepson was all undergraduate. But if you wanted leadership ethics to keep going, I needed doctoral students, and I also wanted to develop young faculty who would work in this area. And so the Institute's put me in a well-placed position to continue doing that. Since I've been there, I've already had a Fulbright fellow come and work with me from Australia, had a visiting scholar from Turkey. I've run the Transatlantic Business Ethics Conference. So it allows me to do a lot of things that, because I'm at a research university, I was limited in doing at the Jepson School. And also when you're a founder, I was the last founder there, so you don't want to, there's a certain point where you don't want to be that person at the faculty meeting who's always saying, well, we used to do it this way. And you know, we had some young people like Terry Price who had come up through the ranks. He took over my chair at Jepson. Perfectly good dean, good faculty. I wouldn't have left that school if I didn't think it was going to do great on its own. And I think it needed me to leave in a way because it needed to sort of go off in its own direction. Being a founder, you can actually weigh down an institution. And so I think it was good all around. And as a side, I love living in Manhattan.
So at Rutgers, now you're developing some of the same kinds of programs, or maybe they were already there that you did, but now with graduate students, could I say that, or with MBAs?
So at Rutgers now I'm working with MBAs. I started out by teaching the undergraduate courses. And I had taught undergraduates for so many years that I actually was looking forward to the MBAs. And the MBAs are a really special group because it's first of all, because they're very diverse, but they're also extremely well educated because most of them I'm in Newark, and Rutgers is in Newark and New Brunswick, and you have all of the major pharmaceutical companies around there, you have all the big banks. So you have people with really interesting backgrounds, and I just find it fun to teach that kind of group of people. Nowadays MBA programs are becoming more the part-time program than the full-time program because of the way people work. So I've completely changed the course that I teach. Again, lots of humanities. It's not a case course. I think a lot of my colleagues teach basically a case study course, but I use case studies, but I do all sorts of other things with them. So that was a chance to really change it. I haven't, but maybe hope to teach a real leadership course. They had a lot of their non-tenure track faculty, more practitioner kind of faculty teaching leadership, but again, it was more like leadership training. I'd like to get my hands on those students and teach a kind of Jepson School type course. So I'm hoping to bring some of what I did at Jepson to there. And the other nice thing, it's just good to have a change. I have wonderful colleagues, and the other strength we have at Rutgers is in my institute I have 6 fellows. We have 6 people who are working in areas of ethics, and that's actually one of the largest groups probably around. I think there's a few other schools that might have that many people, but we got a lot of people working in ethics. I've instituted a program for them. We have lunches together, and we will be doing projects together. So it's a lot of fun. It's a good change, and it kind of is a logical. The more I thought about it when it was first offered, the more logical it seemed to me to go on and to try to develop more of the faculty and students in this area.
Joanne, you said something a while ago that I have been mulling over, and that is about some of the structural and political changes that might be needed beyond an institution to really begin to enhance the business ethics commitment, reputation, number of people who are involved, and so on. I'm thinking about some of the accrediting agencies, the ACSB and others. Do you have any vision for what something might look like that could really make a difference or institutionalize a commitment to business ethics and force business schools, for example, to make it clear that they're doing something and what they're doing?
Right. So I guess, the real challenge we have are some of these structural challenges of making business ethics become a permanent part of business schools. And so I would start, if I could have my way, I'd start with the accreditation groups. And it's interesting, I was in Europe at a conference, and the European accreditation group talked a lot about humanities and ethics, but they seemed to be completely ineffective. So I would start with the accreditation groups at the first level, but more importantly, at the same time, I would start with the rating groups. I would want all of those lists, everything from USA Today ratings on down, to put that into the weighting, because that will motivate deans more than anything else. And then, of course, the other thing is, so you want to look for the course in the curriculum. It has to be in the curriculum, but I also think that there has to be some weight in the rating system that counts for real full-time tenure track faculty teaching it, because I know they account for it in other courses, and there's a whole point system that they use. So we need to get the point system to be substantial in terms of business ethics, because that would create the tenure track positions that we need. Then, of course, the other structural problem we have is that business ethics has one Financial Times rated journal, and that's the Journal of Business Ethics, though everyone in the field knows that the Business Ethics Quarterly is as good. Some might think it's even better, but it doesn't produce as many issues. So the other thing that has to happen is you have to figure out, either we have to work with that system, which is going to be a problem because you can't get people promoted and tenured without it, or we have to work with the other journals to start accepting more business ethics kinds of papers. Those are the other parts that you have to look at. So you have to look at the whole system of what's required in the program, what motivates the deans to do it, what are the structures we need to look at to help people in business ethics get tenure and promotion in them. And I think if we can press on all of those fields, and you can't just do one or two. Unfortunately, you have to do the whole thing to fix the system. If we could do it and keep it going for a while, then you would institutionalize a lot of these roles. I also think businesses need to keep pressure on business schools. What do you want out of people? What do you want out of these students? And I'll give you an interesting example. I've been working with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they're doing a project with, it's business school deans and with people in banks who, they now call them culture officers. And they basically oversee the ethics. And the idea is, how can we work together to improve the ethical standards in banking? And the Federal Reserve's been very interested in this for years. So the deans that I work with, I'm taking my dean's place, that's why I'm there. But the deans, they're from some of the top business schools, and the ones that at least have taken part in this project are very interested in doing it. But there's still, even the ones who say, yes, this is a great idea, unless you have those structural changes, they won't be able to do it either. So, it gets to, well, if the rankings, we have a really #1 finance department, we're not going to spend money on business ethics professors when you got the #1 finance department. You want to keep that going. Or if you're #2, then you're definitely not going to spend money on business ethics. So I think all of these things have to be done together. If the Society of Business Ethics could figure out a way to do this kind of several-pronged initiative over time, I think that would probably be the strongest thing we could do to strengthen the field.